I love the Sega Saturn. It's become one of my favorite game consoles of all time, and it's home to some of my favorite games, like Nights into Dreams and Panzer Dragoon Saga. The Saturn has many gems unique to the platform, and some really cool strengths and quirks, such as superb 2D graphics and the potential for expandability. However, there is no denying that the Saturn was profoundly mishandled and ultimately greatly problematic for Sega. The Saturn had several things against it from the very start, from its initial design and release to its eventual retirement. In the end, the Sega Saturn was one of the biggest crumbling pillars that led to Sega's fall from grace and sad exit from the home console market. There is no denying any of this, that the Saturn was not Sega's wisest move, but did things have to be so disastrous? I don't think so. I think with some quick thinking, close examination, and careful planning, the course could have been corrected so the damage could have been greatly reduced. I have been playing a lot of Saturn lately, and several key ideas on these matters have come to mind. I think I am in a good position to plan these points out. I'm a fan, but I didn't grow up with a Saturn. I didn't get one until I was 16 in 2006, long past its heyday. So I don't have the rose-tinted childhood nostalgia that blurs many feelings and emotions. They say hindsight is 20/20, right? Well, let's put on some glasses and take a look. The first misfire for the Sega Saturn we will discuss occurred before it was even released. The 32X. I know the Sega 32X has a small but fiercely devoted fan base, but it's time to face facts. It was a total mistake. The Sega Genesis/Mega Drive add-on was an impulsive, costly fumble that not only irritated and burned Sega loyalists, it also strained the build-up to Sega Saturn's launch from the gate into the 5th generation console race. Add-ons rarely do a lot to expand the core user base or sales. The Sega Cd, the Genesis's first add-on, is a good example of this, but it at least made sense. The Sega Cd was primarily a response to the success of rival PC Engine/TurboGrafx CD expansion. It served a purpose and made use of a whole new medium with CD-ROMs. While it didn't take off like the PC Engine CD did, at least in its home country of Japan, it checked out for the market at the time in 1991. The 32X, on the other hand, makes very little sense. The 32X was a product of impulse and fear from higher-ups, like Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama, as the SNES climbed the charts and new consoles like the 3DO and Atari Jaguar appeared on the horizons. The Sega 32X was released shy of a year in the US and after the Saturn in Japan. Releasing an add-on for older hardware so close to the launch of all new tech confused and frustrated developers and consumers. This confusion and frustration only grew worse when the 32X add-on was discontinued just over a year later with an anemic library of 34 games. Fans and developers felt burned when this hardware they bought became so quickly obsolete. This damaged confidence in the Saturn going in, despite the Saturn being a huge improvement over the 32X's capabilities. In addition to isolating gamers and the folks that supplied Sega with games, the Sega 32X caused chaos for the Saturn's build-up and eventual launch. This was a crucial time, not only for Sega, but the video game industry as a whole. The 32-bit generation evolved gaming at a great pace, and no one was 100% certain what the future of gaming would be. 3D gaming was still new, and Sega really should have just focused on the Saturn. Sega really needed to stay focused and project an air of strength, certainty, and dedication. If Sega had stayed patient and focused, they could have funneled more time, resources, and money into R&D and marketing for the Saturn. This would have allowed for a better rollout, possibly better, more numerous dev kits, with more developers and gamers on board to help. In addition, they could have possibly come up with a more effective marketing campaign by getting a better feel of the gaming public. With greater confidence, support, and awareness, the Saturn could have enjoyed a more fruitful start, something that would help considerably against the upcoming Sony PlayStation, which boasted a lower cost, easier architecture, friendlier third-party licensing, and not to mention Sony's huge budget. In a world with no 32X, Doom, Star Wars Arcade, Knuckles Chaotix could all have been Saturn launch titles too. These would have been large draws to the system. The Saturn needed all the help it could get from before the very beginning, which brings me to my next point. The North American and also the European launches of the Sega Saturn were disastrous. Higher-ups at Sega of Japan, specifically Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama, ordered the Sega Saturn launch in North America in the fall, before the PlayStation 1. Sega's plan to release a Genesis first in North America ended off paying nicely, and they thought a similar move would help the Saturn as well. Sega of America president Tom Kalinske orchestrated an early surprise launch for the Sega Saturn. Sega initially announced to the public that the Saturn would be releasing on Saturn Day, September 2nd, 1995, aiming to launch with at least 10 titles. Instead, the Sega announced at their E3 press conference that the Saturn would be released right at that moment at select retailers. This proved to be a massive blunder that would cause a ripple effect of misfortune well into the Dreamcast era. This move crippled the early days of the Saturn with retailers, developers, launch titles, and quality control. Sega could only afford a limited number of hardware to select retailers such as Babbage's, Software Etc., EB, and Toys R Us. Many other retailers such as Walmart, Best Buy, KB Toys, and small others were greatly upset at being misled by the false date. This greatly strained their relationship with Sega. KB Toys in particular refused to stock Sega products for the time. In fact, Sega had difficulty keeping up with supplies and wouldn't have things properly fleshed out until around the time of the announced launch window anyway. This decision also hampered Sega's relationship with their release schedule and third-party developers in the Saturn's early days. Most developers were planning to release around the September 1995 window and either had to rush or release games at that later date. The Saturn ended up releasing with only 6 games in North America: Clockwork Knight, Daytona USA, Pebble Beach Golf Links, Panzer Dragoon, Worldwide Soccer, and Virtua Fighter. The Saturn launched with even less games for the rushed European release, with only Clockwork Knight, Daytona USA, and Worldwide Soccer. Most of the interesting games that came out for the Saturn at this time came directly from Sega. Blindsided developers grew frustrated, and many quickly jumped ship. EA would refuse to publish for Sega's next system, the Dreamcast. In fact, only 5 games came up between the launch titles and their announced launch window: Bug, Myst, Astal, Robotica, and Street Fighter the movie The Game. So many of the Saturn's biggest problems in the United States were caused by or worsened by this surprise E3 launch. It made Sega seem foolish in the eyes of the gaming community, and made the curious steer more clear of the Saturn. Sticking with their announced launch window would have saved Sega numerous headaches and started them off on more promising ground. Next, we need to address the game library itself. The Genesis/Mega Drive may not have been a massive success in its home country of Japan like Sega wanted, but it was hugely successful internationally in North America and Europe. It amassed a killer library over the course of its lifespan, with many games holding a special place in many gamers' hearts. It really is a wonder why so many of these beloved 16-bit gems didn't continue onward on the Sega Saturn. Maybe Sega didn't focus on these as much because the Genesis/Mega Drive didn't perform in its home country, and the Saturn was primarily worked on to be successful in Japan first most and internationally second. Still, it's wildly strange that more time and development focus wasn't on furthering these established titles, including first-party favorites like Streets of Rage, Phantasy Star, and Sonic. And don't worry, we'll get more on Sonic later. As well as third-party offerings like Sparkster, Splatterhouse, or Echo the Dolphin. I think if Sega had a steady stream of these games in development over the course of the Saturn's lifespan, and were very vocal and open about their development along the way, that would have helped Sega tremendously with the new Saturn hardware. It might have swayed people from switching to the PlayStation or holding off for the Nintendo 64. So many of these games would have been fantastic on the Saturn. I would have loved a new epic RPG like Phantasy Star, or a sequel to Comic Zone, with the Saturn's beautiful 2D capabilities with new 3D effects. That would have been brilliant. Sadly, either Sega ignored or abandoned many of their legacy series, and it cost them a whole lot in consumer interest. I'm sure part of the reason behind this stupid misstep relates to Sega's internal squabblings, but it really seems like working on at least a few of these games and peppering them throughout the Saturn's lineup would have been an obvious move toward success. Sadly, it was a move Sega would never make with their 32-bit beast. It's a shame, because so many of these games are still loved, still played, and re-released on new platforms and collections. It's insane and sad to think of what could have been. If Sega had put more energy and resources into building off of the successful games from their previous systems, I believe it would have helped them greatly in building a more solid user base. It also can't be overstated how much Sega relied on sports games and blockbusters like Sonic to build their early success. Not capitalizing on these bases they had already built up for the start of the Saturn was a foolish move. If Sega had thrown in something like Sonic and a football game at the start, I really think it could have helped. Western-developed Sega-published games for the Genesis/Mega Drive played a huge part in Sega's success during the 16-bit era in the West. Not all of these games were critically acclaimed or have aged well today, but they certainly helped sales and moved console units. Sega only published around 23 Western-developed games across the Saturn era. Out of all of these games, I'd say only 7 or 8 are worth playing today, and not all of them are even original games. Quake, 3 Dirty Dwarfs, and Mr. Bones are my personal highlights out of this bunch. This is a measly little list compared to the large and varied number of Western-developed Sega-published games released for the Genesis and Mega Drive. I would argue that many of these games are still worth playing, and many have been re-released over time. Sega also failed to secure more faithful agreements with second and third-party developers for the Saturn. Both Sony and Nintendo utilized such developers and benefited greatly from them. Rare helped fill out the N64's library with acclaimed blockbuster games, and Sony snatched up talent and created Sony Computer Entertainment of America, which pumped out big sellers as well. Sony even scooped up rights to the first release of Mortal Kombat 3, a series that was a huge draw for the Genesis and had first-party support from Naughty Dog with Crash Bandicoot, which helped fill the gap that Sonic left behind. Had Sega further pursued these strategies, they could have covered more ground in the gaming market, given developers more experience. Everybody wins. Sadly, Sega dropped the ball in this arena and never regained this footing. In addition to failing to utilize Western developers, Sega also failed to bring success stories from its home country to the rest of the world. So many of the Sega Saturn's best games never left Japan, and many of these games sadly remain Japanese exclusives to this day. Management at Sega of America shied away from releasing many Japanese-style games for most part of this era. This is a huge, confounding error in my opinion, considering how successful the Saturn was in Japan and how much focus there was put into it there. Popular, well-respected games, including many exclusives like Princess Crown, Sakura Wars, Radiant Silvergun, Dragon Force 2, and more were passed on. Many great games, especially RPGs and 2D focused titles, have become extremely popular and well sought out after over time, and were featured imports back in the heyday of the Saturn as well. I admit that this problem has to do with Saturn sales and reputations in the West, but if you take into account some of the other ideas I've mentioned here, releasing these would have been an excellent move. During the 32-bit era, 3D polygonal games were all the rage. There's no denying that. 2D games were beginning to look old-fashioned to the average player. This is true. However, it still would have been better for there to have been more Saturn hardware of this type than none at all. Some games of this style may not have been entirely in vogue, but many of them showed off the Saturn's unique strengths. A key figure behind these decisions, and an overall polarizing figure in Sega history, was former Sega of America president Bernie Stoller. He was not a fan of the Saturn hardware at all, and was very skeptical of the appeal of foreign games. He is known specifically for his distaste of RPGs and less action-heavy games. He shot down ideas and releases that didn't quite fit his Western game vision, and made it harder for others who wanted to break this template. Stoller viewed the Saturn as a failure straight from the gate, even referring to it as a stillborn publicly, which is just a wild decision to me. It was clear he would rather abandon the platform and dismiss it, damaging relations with supporters and fans in America and overseas, but again, more on that later. This isolated some promising second and third party publishers that were initially very interested in supporting the Saturn. Publishers like Working Designs, who ended up releasing some of the system's most sought after games. Companies like them that tried to support and fill the Saturn's empty niche spaces that complemented many of the Saturn's strengths. Many of these publishers grew frustrated enough that they jumped ship and dropped support of the Sega Saturn hardware, and no one ever grew motivated enough to step up and fill those gaps. It's truly a shame because there were many titles that did well on the Saturn in Japan and were sometimes the superior versions of those games. Many got Western releases only on the PlayStation. Several of these games reached critical acclaim and fan acclaim on the rival PlayStation hardware too. Games like Lunar 1 and 2, Dead or Alive, Grandia, and other games that were very successful and could have brought acclaim and money to the Saturn as well. By ignoring and/or refusing to release these titles and neglecting third-party publishers and developers, Sega thinned their release lineup and starved fans of quality releases. In fact, many Saturn fans back then, and still today, resorted to importing games from Japan to satisfy their playing and collecting needs. To this day, it is much easier and less costly to collect Japanese Saturn games than American or European ones. I feel that if Sega had broadened their release horizons, it would have greatly benefited them. Something that backs up these thoughts is how successful and well received the import, fan translation, and reproduction scenes are today. The scene has really expanded in the past 10 years as understanding of the Sega Saturn hardware has developed. Games like Sakura Wars, Shining Force 2, Scenario 2 and 3, Police Knots, Bulk Slash, and the upcoming Princess Crown and Wakanroder translations have fans very excited. These fan-translated games are proving to be high-quality products and very well received by those that play them. They are bringing more attention to the Saturn. More and more people are finally singing its praises and realizing what could have been. There really was and still is a market and interest in Japanese-only Saturn games to be accessible to players in the West. I can't deny that the North American gaming landscape was very different in the mid to late 90s compared to today. It took a couple years for RPGs to truly blow up with a boom that followed Final Fantasy VII. Interest was quickly shifting to 3D, but overall interest in what the Saturn had to offer wasn't gone completely. Loyalists and fans were still hungry for more. I think that if some of these games were available in the West, it would have given the Saturn a leg up. Not necessarily on the same level as the PlayStation, but enough to make a small difference in Sega as a whole. By embracing what Sega of America and Sega of Europe left out, Sega could have established a unique identity. They could have carved out their own special niche. What could have been, in this regard, will forever be tantalizing. That's it for Part 1. In Part 2, we will be exploring Sega's fan base, internal squabblings at Sega, the lead up to the Dreamcast, and more. I hope you join me as I further explore the Sega Saturn and how its tragic trajectory could have been at least somewhat corrected. I really want to thank the folks at the Retro Game Wars Discord for their help in formulating and rewriting the script. They've been a huge help. If you like what I've shared so far, please like, comment, and share this video around, and consider checking out some of my other videos. It really helps me out a lot. That's all for now. Later!